You will not survive this winter under my roof. That's what Patricia Ashford told me, standing in her doorway in a robe the color of money while snow came down sideways behind her like it had something to prove. "Bring the car around, Roland," she said to my husband, not even looking at me. "She'll find her own way." 6 years is a long time to remember the exact sound of a door closing. It is also long enough to build a hospital wing with your name on the deed and never once raise your voice about it. If this is the kind of story that speaks to you, go ahead and subscribe to Move On and Never Give Up right now, because we put out a new one every single week, and trust me, you don't want to miss where this one goes. My name doesn't matter as much as what I did with what was done to me, but I'll tell you anyway. I'm Camille Renard, and before any of this happened, I was a nurse practitioner working night shifts at a community clinic in Macon, Georgia, saving what I could, dreaming a little bigger than my paycheck allowed. I grew up in a house where my mother stretched one chicken into 3 dinners and still made sure I had piano lessons on Saturdays. She used to tell me, "Baby, don't ever let nobody make you feel small in a house you helped build." I didn't understand what she meant until I was 31 years old, standing in a blizzard, finding out exactly how small some people wanted me to feel. I met Roland Ashford at a hospital fundraiser I wasn't even supposed to be at. I'd come with a coworker who canceled last minute, and I almost left before the second course. Roland was charming in that practiced way old money teaches its sons, but underneath it there was something real, or at least something I convinced myself was real. His family owned Ashford Regional Medical, a private hospital system that had been in Connecticut for 3 generations, built by his grandfather and expanded by his father into one of the most respected networks in the state. Patricia, his mother, ran the board with a grip so tight the staff called her the chairwoman, even in casual conversation. His father, Harold, had passed 2 years before I came into the picture, which meant Patricia's word was closer to scripture than suggestion. They did not approve of me from the start, and they were not subtle about it. Patricia's disapproval came dressed as concern. She'd ask me at dinner what my 5-year plan was, in a tone that suggested she already knew the answer was insufficient. Roland's younger brother, Preston, who worked in hospital administration and had never held a job he didn't inherit, liked to make comments about certain people marrying into certain families for certain reasons, and then act surprised when I exactly understood what he meant. I told myself Roland would handle it. I told myself love was supposed to be work. I told myself that once we were married, once I proved myself, the ice would melt. I was wrong about most of that, and the thing about being wrong in that particular way is you keep believing it long after the evidence stops supporting you, because the alternative means admitting the man you married will let his family treat you like a mistake he's still deciding whether to correct. We got married in a small ceremony that Patricia insisted on downsizing, for taste, she said. I worked 2 more years at the clinic before Roland asked me to step back and help manage the Family Foundation's community outreach program. Unpaid, of course, because family doesn't need a salary, according to Patricia. I said yes because I wanted to build something with them, not around them. I threw myself into that outreach work. I built partnerships with 3 underserved clinics in Hartford. I designed a maternal health initiative that cut infant mortality rates in 2 zip codes the hospital had historically ignored. Patricia took credit for it at the next board meeting without blinking, calling it the direction I always envisioned for this family's legacy. I let it go. I let a lot of things go. That's usually how it starts. You letting things go one at a time until you look up and realize you've let go of yourself. The trip to their lake house in the Berkshires was supposed to be a Christmas tradition, the kind Roland talked about like it meant something sacred. The whole family gathered the week before the holiday, a fire going, Harold's old rifle mounted over the mantel like a monument to a man none of them actually missed as much as they performed missing him. I didn't want to go that year. I was 6 months pregnant, exhausted, and Patricia had spent Thanksgiving making comments about whether I was eating for the baby or eating for comfort. Roland told me it would look strange if I skipped it, that appearances mattered to his mother more than almost anything, and I went because I still believed, foolishly, that showing up counted for something with these people. The argument started over nothing, the way the real ones always do. I'd mentioned at dinner that I thought the foundation should expand its Hartford partnerships instead of funding another gala. Patricia set down her fork with a precision that told me the conversation was already over before I finished my sentence. She said the foundation's direction was not a discussion, it was a decision, and it had already been made without me, same as everything else apparently had been. I said something back, I don't even remember exactly what, something about how I'd built the program she was taking credit for, and the room went the particular kind of quiet that happens right before people stop pretending. Preston laughed, actually laughed, and said maybe I should go cool off outside since I liked the cold so much when I was working those outreach visits in neighborhoods people like us don't usually go. Heavy, aching. Roland said nothing. That's the part I go back to most. Not what Patricia said, not what Preston said, but the silence where my husband should have been. Walked out onto the porch to get some air, more to remove myself from the table than to make any kind of statement, and Patricia followed me out. She said in a voice colder than the wind coming off the lake that she'd spent 30 years building the Ashford name into something respected, and she was not going to watch a woman who came from nothing in particular unravel it from the inside. I told her I never asked to be anything more than his wife and a partner in the work she claimed to care about. She said the storm was picking up, and it might do me some good to sit with that thought for a while. Then she stepped back inside, and I heard the deadbolt turn. I stood there in disbelief for a long moment, certain it was a mistake, certain someone would notice, certain Roland would come find me within minutes. I knocked. Nobody answered. I knocked harder, called his name, called Patricia's name, watched the porch light through the window go dark on purpose. The snow had already started collecting on my shoulders. My phone was inside, charging in the bedroom because Patricia had a rule about devices at the dinner table, a rule I'd followed like everything else. I was 6 months pregnant, in a sweater dress on a porch in the Berkshires with a blizzard warning that'd been on every local news channel since morning, and the people who were supposed to protect me had locked the door and turned off the light. I want you to sit with that for a second because I think about it more than almost anything else in this story. It is one thing to be unwanted. It is another thing entirely to be unwanted and then made an obstacle to be weathered out. I made it to the neighbor's cabin a quarter-mile down the road, half frozen, shaking so hard I could barely knock, carrying a baby I did not yet know I'd almost lost that night. An older man named Elias Freeman opened the door, took one look at me and didn't ask a single question before pulling me inside and calling for help. I spent 3 days in a hospital in Pittsfield, not an Ashford hospital, being told how close I'd come to losing the pregnancy to hypothermia and stress. Roland showed up on the second day with an explanation about how the storm had knocked out communication, how he'd assumed I'd gone to a neighbor's, how his mother hadn't meant it the way it sounded. I looked at him and understood, with the kind of clarity that only shows up once everything else has burned away, that he was never going to choose me over that house, and I was done waiting to see if he would. I filed for divorce 4 months after our daughter, Nadia, was born. Patricia fought it, not out of any love for me, but because a public divorce embarrassed the Ashford name more than a locked door in a blizzard ever would. Practically, I didn't fight the fight she wanted. I took what was legally mine, which was not much, and I took my daughter, and I left Connecticut with 2 suitcases and a car that barely made it to my sister's place outside Atlanta. I want to be honest with you here because this channel isn't about pretending the rebuild is easy just because the ending is good. There were nights I sat in my sister's Denise's guest room with Nadia asleep on my chest, wondering if I'd imagined how bad it really was, wondering if I was the problem, the way people who've been made small for a long time start to wonder. What got me through wasn't rage. It was remembering the maternal health program I'd built, the one Patricia took credit for, the one that actually worked. I knew how to do the thing that mattered. Nobody had given me that skill. They couldn't take it either. I went back to nursing first at a hospital in Atlanta, nights again, Nadia with my sister while I worked, but I started taking healthcare administration courses at night, slow, one class at a time, because I'd seen up close how hospital systems actually get run, and I'd seen up close how badly they can be run by people who inherited authority instead of earning it. It took me 3 years to finish my master's while working full-time and raising my daughter. It took another 2 years of climbing, first as a department coordinator, then as an operations director at a growing regional health system in Georgia, one that was hungry, undercapitalized, and looking for someone who understood both the clinical side and the business side well enough to fix what was broken. I was that person. I made myself that person on purpose. By year 5, I wasn't just working for that health system, I was one of its senior leaders, sitting in rooms where acquisition strategy got discussed, where struggling hospitals became opportunities for stronger networks to absorb. And it was in one of those rooms, going through a list of underperforming regional facilities up for acquisition, that I saw the name Ashford Regional Medical. I didn't say anything in that meeting. I went home that night and sat with it the way you sit with something you've waited a long time for without letting yourself admit you were waiting. Ashford Regional had been bleeding money for 3 years. Preston had been running operations since Patricia stepped back for health reasons. And Preston, as it turned out, was exactly as competent at running a hospital system as he'd been at everything else he'd inherited and never earned. Contracts had lapsed, 2 satellite clinics had closed, the board, the same board that once celebrated Patricia stealing my program, was quietly looking for a buyer before the whole system collapsed under its own debt. I brought the acquisition proposal to my CEO myself. I didn't tell her the history, I told her the numbers, because the numbers told the story better than I ever could. A respected regional system with strong bones and catastrophic management, sitting right in our expansion footprint. She trusted my judgment enough to not ask why I wanted to lead the negotiation personally. I think some part of her sensed there was more to it, and some part of her, God bless her, didn't need me to explain it. The negotiations took 4 months. I sat across from Ashford's outside counsel twice without ever appearing in the room myself, letting our acquisition team handle the early meetings while I built the actual financial architecture behind the deal. That was deliberate. I wanted the terms locked before anyone on that side understood who they were really negotiating with. When the final agreement was ready, when the majority stake had transferred, when Ashford Regional Medical became, on paper, a subsidiary of the system I'd spent 5 years helping build, I asked to lead the transition meeting myself. I walked into that boardroom on a Tuesday morning in December, almost exactly 6 years, to the week since I'd stood on that porch and heard a deadbolt turn against me. Patricia was there, thinner than I remembered, her authority visibly diminished, but her posture just as rigid. Preston sat where his father used to sit, looking like a man who'd been bracing for bad news he didn't yet know the shape of. Roland was there too, on the board now, in name more than function, and when he saw me walk in behind our legal team, I watched something in his face rearrange itself slowly, the way ice does right before it cracks. Patricia recovered first, because Patricia always recovered first. She said my name like it was an accusation. I told her I was there in my capacity as Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations for the health system that now held majority ownership of Ashford Regional Medical, and that I'd be leading the transition. I said it the way you'd read a weather report. Calm, factual, nothing in my voice for her to grab onto. Preston asked, in a voice that cracked slightly on the second word, how long I'd known. I told him it didn't matter how long I'd known. What mattered was what I'd built while they weren't paying attention. I told the room, all of them, that operations would continue without disruption for the staff and patients who depended on this hospital, because none of what happened at that lake house was ever their fault, and none of them deserved to pay for a family's failures with their livelihoods. Then I looked at Patricia directly, for the first time since I'd walked in, and I told her something I'd carried for 6 years without ever planning to say it out loud. I told her that the night she locked that door, she believed the storm would finish what she didn't have the nerve to say directly, that I would either freeze or fold, and either outcome would solve her problem quietly. I told her I understood now that her confidence that night wasn't really about me at all. It was about her own certainty that people like me don't come back from rooms like that one. I told her she was right that I didn't come back the same. I came back as the person signing off on her hospital's survival. I didn't raise my voice once. There wasn't a version of that moment where volume would have made it land any harder than the facts already did. Roland tried to speak to me privately after the meeting, and I let him, briefly, because I wasn't interested in cruelty, only clarity. He apologized in the vague, general way people apologize when they still haven't fully reckoned with what they allowed. I told him Nadia was doing beautifully, that she asked about her father sometimes, and I always answered honestly, and that if he wanted a real relationship with his daughter, it would have to be built the same way I built everything else in the last 6 years, on purpose, with consistency, without expecting credit for showing up late. I think about that porch sometimes, still, usually on the first real cold night of winter, when the air changes the way it did that evening. What I understand now that I didn't understand shivering on those steps is that Patricia Ashford wasn't trying to send a message that night. She was making a calculation that a pregnant woman with nothing in her name and no family money behind her posed no real threat worth managing carefully. She miscalculated the one variable she never bothered to account for, which is that people who've had to build things from nothing their whole lives generally know how to keep building, even when you take away the roof. There's something I want to leave you with before we close this one out. The people who lock the door on you, who leave you out in the cold thinking you'll simply disappear into it, they're not usually cruel because they hate you specifically. They're cruel because they've decided you don't count enough to be an inconvenience. What Camille understood on the other side of that door was that the coldest night of her life was also the last night she ever needed anyone's permission to matter. If this story means something to you, go ahead and hit subscribe on Move On and Never Give Up, and share it with somebody who needs reminding today that the door closing on you might just be the beginning of the story where you build your own.